When we think about the concept of marriage in Islam, the very first thing that comes to mind is the reality that marriage is not simply a social contract between two individuals, but rather it is a sacred amana, a trust given by Allah Himself. Dr. Yasir Qadhi often stresses this point with deep seriousness. When two people enter into the bond of nikah, they are not just entering into a relationship for companionship or for worldly enjoyment. They are binding themselves to one of the most powerful institutions that Allah has created for the betterment of humanity. Allah describes marriage in the Quran as one of His signs, a clear indication of His mercy. And among His signs is that He created for you spouses from among yourselves, so that you may find tranquility in them, and He placed between you love and mercy. Surah Ar-Now 30:21. This verse alone shows that marriage is a sign of Allah's greatness, a vehicle of sakina, rahmah, and mawaddah. So how can something so lofty, so elevated, be reduced to a running joke or careless banter about getting a second wife? Dr. Ye explains that when people begin to trivialize sacred matters, it reflects not only a lack of maturity, but also a deficiency in understanding the seriousness of what Allah has legislated. To joke about such a matter is to indirectly undermine the values that Islam has placed around the institution of marriage. The Prophet FDFA himself cautioned us about the power of words. In a famous hadith, he said that a person may utter a word without thinking, yet it leads them to fall into the depths of Jahannam. Words matter. They carry weight. They can build hearts, and they can break hearts. When men, often casually among friends, laugh and tease about getting a second wife, they fail to realize that they are speaking about an amana, a trust that has direct implications on the dignity and emotions of real people, their wives, their families, their children. It is important to remember that Islam did not establish nikah for entertainment. It is not meant to be a punchline to pass the time or an anecdote to amuse a gathering. Rather, it is a contract witnessed by Allah Himself. When the nikah is performed, the angels bear witness, and the very heavens recognize the establishment of a bond that is blessed. For a Muslim to turn such a matter into a joke is to strip it of its sanctity and reduce it to the level of worldly amusement. This is where Dr. Yasir Qadhi often reminds the community, one of the tragedies of our times is how we take sacred concepts and reduce them into cultural cliches. Jokes about marriage, jokes about divorce, jokes about second wives, these things may seem harmless in the moment, but they slowly erode the seriousness with which we view Allah's commands. Moreover, when men make these jokes, they often ignore the emotional consequences. A wife who hears her husband laugh about taking another wife may not always express her hurt, but in her heart, she may feel belittled, insecure, or disrespected. Dr. Yasir Qadhi emphasizes that this kind of casual insensitivity is itself a form of zulm and injustice. Allah will hold us accountable not just for our deeds, but also for the way we made others feel, especially those closest to us. The Prophet FD said, "The best of you are those who are best to their wives, and I am the best of you to my wives." Notice how the Prophet linked excellence in faith and character directly with how a man treats his wife. It is not how long your beard is, how many prayers you attend in the masjid, or how many Islamic lectures you listen to that defines your real character. Rather, it is how you behave with your spouse behind closed doors. To make her heart feel small by careless joking about a second wife is the very opposite of prophetic character. There is also another dimension here that Dr. Yasir Qadhi often highlights, which is the accountability before Allah. Marriage is an amana because Allah will ask you on the Day of Judgment, how did you treat this woman who left her family, her home, her comfort to live with you and build a life with you? Did you protect her dignity? Did you uplift her heart? Did you provide her with safety and compassion? Or did you belittle her with sarcasm and jokes? Each word uttered carries weight, and the angels are recording. This is why joking about such serious matters is not innocent humor. It has consequences in this world and the next. Furthermore, there is an element of hypocrisy when men joke about this topic. Many of those who laugh about a second wife are not even fulfilling the responsibilities towards their first wife properly. Are they providing for her fully, Are they emotionally supporting her? Are they giving her time, patience, and compassion? If the answer is no, then to even make jokes about taking on another amana is a sign of heedlessness. Dr. Yasir Qadhi calls this the disconnect between desire and responsibility. We want the benefits without carrying the burdens. Islam, however, teaches the opposite. The higher the blessing, the greater the responsibility. When Allah calls marriage an amana, He is reminding us that it is a test. Just as money, health, and knowledge are trusts that we will be asked about, marriage is also a trust. A strong believer carries his amana with dignity, without mockery, without trivialization. He recognizes that the words he utters shape his own character and affect the hearts of those around him. This is why Dr. Yasir Qadhi constantly urges us to elevate our discourse. Instead of making jokes about marriage, we should speak about its beauty, its challenges, and its responsibilities. We should remind each other that the home is a place of worship, that treating one's wife with respect is a pathway to Jannah, and that safeguarding the dignity of marriage is part of safeguarding the dignity of the Imam. When our speech becomes refined, our hearts become refined. And when our hearts are refined, our relationships flourish with the mercy and barakah of Allah. Polygamy is one of the most misunderstood topics in Islam, both by Muslims themselves and by those outside the faith. Dr. Yasir Qadhi often clarifies that the Quran's allowance for a man to marry more than one wife is not a blank check for personal amusement, nor is it an encouragement to pursue unchecked desires. Rather, it is a concession, a permission that comes with a heavy set of conditions and responsibilities. Allah revealed in Surah An-Nisa, Agisa, then marry those that please you of women, 2, 3, or 4. But if you fear that you cannot deal justly, then only 1, 4, 3. This verse is clear in its structure. Yes, there is an allowance, but there is also a strict warning: justice is the determining factor. And justice, as Dr. Yasir Qadhi repeatedly reminds, is not a light word. It means fairness in every aspect: time, finances, emotions, and treatment. When men casually joke about having a second wife, they treat this allowance as though it is a cultural punchline, forgetting that it is, in fact, one of the most serious responsibilities one can undertake. Dr. Yasir Qadhi explains that the permission of polygamy was revealed in a specific historical and social context. It was during a time of war when many women were left widowed and many children orphaned. Allowing men, under strict conditions, to marry more than one wife was a means of protecting vulnerable women and ensuring that they did not remain destitute. It was not about fulfilling ego-driven fantasies or giving men a reason to boast. To turn such a serious concession into a joke today is to distort the divine wisdom behind it. Another point that Dr. Yasir Qadhi highlights is that most men who joke about polygamy are not in a position to practice it in the first place. Justice between wives is an obligation so difficult that even the prophet letter himself, the best of creation, used to make dua to Allah and say, "Oh Allah, this is my distribution concerning what I control, so do not blame me for what you control, and I do not." This shows that even the messenger of Allah, Latrefdiye, with his perfection of character, would seek Allah's forgiveness in matters of fairness between his wives. If this was the case for him, then what about ordinary men of today who struggle to maintain fairness with even one wife? Dr. Yasir Qadhi often critiques the shallow way this topic is handled in Muslim cultures. Instead of seeing polygamy as an amana that requires maturity, financial capability, and deep emotional wisdom, many reduce it to locker room talk, teasing their friends, or throwing the idea around in family settings. This trivialization not only harms the perception of marriage, but also creates unnecessary tension in households. Wives who hear such jokes feel insecure. Children overhearing them may grow up with a distorted understanding of what marriage represents, and society at large begins to associate Islam with insensitivity rather than mercy. The reality, as explained by scholars like Dr. Yasir Qadhi, is that polygamy is not for everyone. It is a serious commitment that only a few can fulfill properly. Financially, it requires double provision. Emotionally, it requires double energy. Spiritually, it requires double accountability. The Quran's emphasis on justice is not limited to the surface level of providing food and shelter, but extends to the subtler aspects of affection, respect, and presence. If a man spends one evening with one wife, he must spend an equal evening with the other. If he buys a gift for one, he must do the same for the other. If he provides a certain standard of living to one, he must ensure the same for the other. This is not a matter of humor. It is a matter of profound responsibility. Dr. Yasir Qadhi also explains that the danger of making jokes about this is that it desensitizes the heart. When we laugh about something repeatedly, we lose our ability to appreciate its seriousness. A man who constantly jokes about taking a second wife may slowly begin to treat the idea as casual and might even attempt it without realizing the gravity of what he is doing. But Islam does not want men to approach marriage casually. It wants them to approach it with taqwa. The Prophet when speaking about justice between wives, warned that the one who is unfair will come on the day of judgment with half of his body leaning, a visible sign of imbalance. That alone should be enough to silence the laughter and instill a sense of awe about the responsibility. It is also important to recognize that polygamy, when done correctly, can be a mercy, but when done incorrectly, it can be a disaster. Dr. Yasir Qadhi has often stated that the number of cases where polygamy succeeds in our times is very small compared to the number of cases where it causes pain, division, and conflict. And why? Because men approach it without the maturity and taqwa required. They think it is about rights without recognizing that it is more about duties. They want the title of having multiple wives without the burden of supporting multiple families equally. This imbalance leads to broken households, children growing up with resentment, and wives living in bitterness. To make light of this reality through jokes is to make light of the suffering that many actually endure. When the Quran speaks of justice and polygamy, it is not just setting a guideline. It is laying down a condition. Dr. Yasir Qadhi emphasizes that the verse ends with "then," only one "e" for a reason. That reason is to protect families, to protect women, to protect children, and to ensure that men do not abuse what Allah has permitted. This is why he repeatedly reminds audiences that in most cases today, men are better off focusing on fulfilling the amana of one wife properly rather than daydreaming or joking about adding another. If you cannot maintain balance in your words, in your temper, in your treatment, then how can you expect to maintain balance in multiple households? So the next time a group of men laughs about a second wife, the reminder should echo in their hearts. This is not a meme. This is not a joke. This is not a cultural pastime. This is a ruling from Allah that carries immense weight, immense responsibility, and immense accountability in the Akhirah. It is not about ego, it is about amana. It is not about desire, it is about justice. It is not about laughter, it is about taqwa. One of the greatest signs of aman is how we treat the people closest to us, and in particular, how we treat our spouses. Dr. Yasir Qadhi often emphasizes that when the Quran and Sunnah speak about marriage, they are not simply laying down legalistic rules. They are also speaking to the emotional and spiritual side of the relationship. To make careless jokes about taking a second wife might seem small to the one making the joke, but in reality, it can cut deeply into the heart of the woman who hears it. A wife is not just a roommate or a financial dependent. She is someone who has left her home, her family, her comfort, and entrusted her life to her husband. She gives her loyalty, her companionship, and her support. For that woman to be made to feel insecure, belittled, or mocked through light-hearted banter is a violation of the amana Allah has placed upon the husband. The Prophet was extraordinarily careful in safeguarding the emotions of his wives. He never humiliated them publicly or made them the subject of his humor. When Dr. Yasir Qadhi explains this aspect of the Prophet's character, he reminds us that part of the perfection of the Messenger's akhlaq was his ability to combine firmness in principles with gentleness in relationships. He would joke, yes, but never at the expense of the dignity of his family. His humor brought smiles, not wounds. Contrast this with the modern tendency of men who think it is harmless to laugh with friends about getting a second wife. Such words might be shrugged off by men in the gathering, but the woman who overhears them may feel a sting in her heart that lingers for days or weeks. Dr. Yasir Qadhi often draws attention to the subtle forms of zulm that we may not even recognize as oppression. Physical harm is an obvious injustice, financial neglect is clear, but what about emotional harm? A sarcastic comment, a repeated joke, a careless word, these can pierce the heart in ways that are not visible but are still deeply painful. The Prophet warned against this kind of behavior when he said, "Do not harm the believing men and women, for whoever harms them has burdened himself with a manifest slander and a clear sin." Harm is not limited to physical harm. It includes psychological harm, and in marriage it often takes the form of words that degrade rather than uplift. In many cultures, men excuse these jokes by saying, "Oh, I was just playing, I didn't mean it seriously." But Dr. Yasir Qadhi explains that sincerity of intent does not erase the impact of words. The Quran itself cautions believers about making jokes in serious matters. Allah says, Allah's verses and his messenger that you were mocking, make no excuse you have disbelieved after your belief. 965:66. If mocking religious truths can nullify faith, then surely mocking sacred institutions like marriage, even in jest, can corrode one's taqwa and one's sensitivity to the sanctity of relationships. The believer should be more mindful than anyone else about how his speech affects others. Another important point that Dr. Yasir Qadhi often raises is that marriage is meant to be a source of peace and security. Allah uses the word sakina, tranquility, in describing the purpose of marriage. If a husband's words create anxiety instead of tranquility, if his jokes create insecurity instead of reassurance, then he is failing to provide that sakina. Words should be a shield that protect a wife's heart, not daggers that pierce it. This is why the Prophet taught that of the most perfect of believers in faith are those best in character, and the best of you are those who are best to their wives. Notice the linkage. Faith, character, and treatment of wives are intertwined. To harm the heart of one's wife through careless joking is to damage one's own man and one's own character. There is also a social consequence to these jokes. Children who grow up hearing their father joke about taking another wife may internalize a distorted idea of marriage, that it is something casual, subject to humor, and that the feelings of women do not matter. This passes down a legacy of insensitivity. Instead of raising sons who see marriage as an amana and daughters who see it as a sanctuary, such households raise children who see it as a source of conflict or insecurity. Dr. Yasir Qadhi reminds us that the family is the building block of the ummah, and when the building block is weakened by disrespect and careless speech, the entire structure of the community suffers. In addition, there is a profound hypocrisy in men who demand respect from their wives but fail to give respect in return. A husband may expect his wife to honor him, obey him, and support him, yet he feels free to make her the subject of his humor. Dr. Yasir Qadhi explains that leadership in Islam is not about domination but about responsibility. The husband is qawwam, a maintainer and protector, not a joker who wounds the heart of the one he is meant to protect. Respect must be mutual, and the husband is obligated to set the standard by embodying prophetic mercy and sensitivity. The Quran describes the marital relationship as one of libas, that spouses are garments for one another. A garment shields, protects, and beautifies. If the garment is torn, the body is exposed. If the garment is thin, the cold is felt. If the garment is humiliating, the person suffers. Similarly, when a husband makes careless jokes about a second wife, he tears the garment of dignity that marriage is supposed to provide. Instead of being a source of warmth, his words become a source of coldness. Instead of being a covering of security, his jokes become an exposure of vulnerability. This is why Dr. Yasir Qadhi continuously calls on men to rise above the shallow cultural norms of their surroundings. It might be common in some communities to joke in this way, but the believer is not a slave to culture. He is a servant of Allah, and Allah has commanded him to speak only that which is good and speak to people good words. 2:83 If the standard for speaking to a people in general is goodness, then what about the standard for speaking to one's own wife, the one who shares his home, his struggles, his secrets, and his soul? Surely the obligation to guard her heart is even greater. When a man speaks about the idea of a second wife in a joking manner, he often frames it as if it were a matter of lighthearted fun, as though it is about expanding his options or entertaining a fantasy. Yet in reality, what he is speaking about is not an addition to pleasure, but an addition to responsibility. Dr. Yasir Qadhi frequently points out that in Islam, every blessing comes with a corresponding amana, a trust, and the greater the blessing, the heavier the amana. Having more than one wife is not about doubling one's enjoyment. It is about doubling one's accountability. This is why the Quran ties polygamy directly to justice, because without justice, what could have been a blessing becomes an act of oppression. When men reduce the idea to a joke, they ignore the fact that what they are laughing about is in fact a serious trial that most are not prepared to handle. Think about the day-to-day responsibilities of marriage. Providing financially for food, shelter, clothing, and general well-being is already a challenge for many men. Add to that the emotional needs of a wife, her need for attention, love, companionship, reassurance, and presence. These are not luxuries but rights that Islam has guaranteed her. The Prophet said, "It is sufficient sin for a man to neglect those whom he is responsible for." Neglect here is not only about failing to feed or clothe, but also about failing to provide emotional stability. Now imagine multiplying these responsibilities by 2. It is not only double the finances, but double the patience, double the attention, double the energy, and double the presence. When Dr. Yasir Qadhi explains this point, he often emphasizes that many men barely manage to fulfill the rights of one wife adequately. To then think that they could easily take on another and still maintain fairness is self-delusion. Another dimension is the spiritual weight of responsibility. The Prophet gave a clear warning about the dangers of failing to uphold justice between wives. He said, "Whoever has 2 wives and inclines toward one over the other will come on the day of judgment with half of his body leaning." This imagery is not just symbolic. It reflects the reality that injustice in marriage is a major sin with severe consequences in the hereafter. When a man jokes about a second wife, he overlooks this terrifying accountability. He laughs about something that could be the very cause of his downfall in the akhirah. Dr. Yasir Qadhi often stresses that a believer should always view responsibilities through the lens of taqwa, not ego. The question should never be, "Do I want this?" but rather, "Am I ready to stand before Allah and answer for this?" It is also worth noting that marriage is not a transaction limited to 2 people. It creates a ripple effect across families and communities. A man who takes on a second wife has to consider the impact not only on his first wife, but also on his children, his in-laws, and his extended family. Every choice he makes will affect multiple households. Dr. Yasir Qadhi explains that when a man thinks only about himself, he betrays the amana, because marriage in Islam is meant to build strong families, and strong families build strong communities. To make jokes about polygamy while ignoring the broader consequences is to trivialize the social fabric of the imam. Furthermore, the emotional burden on the first wife cannot be dismissed. A woman who hears her husband consistently joke about marrying another might feel unappreciated, as though her efforts and sacrifices are not enough. This insecurity can destabilize the home, leading to resentment, arguments, and emotional distance. The husband may laugh in the moment, but he is slowly planting seeds of distrust that can eventually harm his own marriage. Dr. Yasir Qadhi explains that true masculinity in Islam is not about asserting one's power or feeding one's desires, but about showing restraint, wisdom, and compassion. The Prophet embodied this balance perfectly. He was strong in his leadership, but gentle with his wives. He did not belittle them, nor did he use his authority to make them feel small. The Quran calls marriage Methicin, G-H-I-L, I'm Macron, letter 1 and 3 N. This phrase appears only a few times in the Quran, and each time it is used, it refers to something of immense gravity. To break or belittle such a covenant is a serious matter. When a man jokes about taking another wife, he is indirectly belittling the covenant he already has. He is saying, in effect, that one solemn covenant is not enough, and that he can treat it lightly while fantasizing about another. Dr. Yasir Qadhi reminds us that such an attitude not only disrespects the first wife, but also disrespects the very concept of nikah as a sacred contract. Even if a man were to seriously consider a second marriage, the preparation it requires is immense. He would need to examine his finances, his time, his emotional bandwidth, and most importantly, his intention. Is it truly for the sake of Allah to uphold justice and provide for another soul who might otherwise suffer? Or is it driven by desire, ego, or societal pressure? Dr. Yasir Qadhi stresses that the intention behind polygamy matters just as much as the action itself. Without sincerity and taqwa, the action becomes a cause of sin rather than a means of reward. And if a man is not ready for this reality, then to joke about it is even more inappropriate. Ultimately, jokes about a second wife mask a deeper problem: the failure to appreciate the weight of responsibility that marriage itself carries. Instead of viewing marriage as a platform for growth, worship, and service, it is reduced to a source of amusement. This mentality weakens the seriousness with which men approach all aspects of family life. Dr. Yasir Qadhi urges men to remember that marriage is one of the most important tests in life, and success in it is tied directly to success in the hereafter. To treat the idea of multiplying this test as a joke is not only immature but spiritually reckless. When we look at the life of the Prophet, we see in him the perfect example of how a man should treat his wives. And this example is not limited to outward actions, but extends deeply into his words, his character, and his manner of interaction. Dr. Yasir Qadhi often emphasizes that the Prophet Letrife's marriages were not about personal amusement or casual decisions, but about profound wisdom, sacrifice, and responsibility. Each of his marriages had a context, a purpose, and a benefit to the benefit. Whether it was to care for a widow, to strengthen tribal bonds, or to spread the message of Islam through close companions who learned from his household, every marriage carried a wisdom far beyond what ordinary men can imagine. Yet despite the weight of these purposes, the Prophet Letrife never once made a joke at the expense of his wives, nor did he use humor to create insecurity in their hearts. His treatment of his wives was marked by compassion, respect, and the utmost gentleness. Dr. Yasir Qadhi explains that the Prophet Letrife was a man who had immense responsibilities on his shoulders, leading the Ummah, receiving revelation, dealing with enemies, and guiding a community from darkness into light, yet he never neglected his duties at home. He would serve his family, mend his clothes, milk his goat, and spend quality time with his wives. Even when the world outside was filled with struggles, he ensured that the home remained a place of love and peace. For a man of such stature who could have justified being distant or preoccupied, to still prioritize the emotions of his wives demonstrates the importance of this responsibility for all men. If he, the messenger of Allah Letrife, never dismissed the feelings of his wives with careless words, then what excuse does any ordinary man have? The Prophet Letrife's humor was lighthearted and uplifting. There are narrations of him racing with Isha, of him calling her affectionate nicknames, and of him creating moments of joy in their lives. But that humor never turned into sarcasm, nor did it belittle her. Dr. Yasir Qadhi highlights this point often to show that humor in marriage is a sunnah, but it must be the kind of humor that strengthens the bond, not weakens it. When men today make jokes about a second wife, they think they are being playful, but in reality, they are imitating nothing from the sunnah and instead engaging in behavior that the Prophet himself would never have done. True prophetic humor builds confidence in the wife, while this modern form of joking tears it down. It is also important to remember that the Prophet Letrife dealt with complex marital situations. He had multiple wives, each with her own personality, emotions, and concerns. Naturally, there were moments of jealousy or tension, yet he handled them with patience, wisdom, and fairness. He never responded with arrogance, nor did he use the situation to assert dominance through jokes or dismissive remarks. Dr. Yasir Qadhi points out that one of the reasons the Prophet's example is so timeless is because he showed us that even in the most challenging marital dynamics, respect and gentleness must be maintained. Men who think it is unmanly to joke about another wife are in fact displaying weakness, because true strength is shown in the ability to control one's tongue and nurture one's household with dignity. Another critical lesson from the Prophet FD's marriages is his sense of justice. He divided his time fairly, he treated each wife with respect, and he never allowed favoritism to manifest in a way that would cause harm. This fairness was not just about external arrangements, but also about the internal state of his heart. Even though love is not something one can control fully, the Prophet FD would still make dua to Allah, acknowledging this limitation, asking for forgiveness if his heart leaned while his actions remained just. Yasir Qadhi explains that this constant awareness of justice shows how seriously the Prophet FD's responsibilities. For men today who joke casually about polygamy without even thinking of the justice involved in a single marriage, this example should be a wake-up call. Moreover, the Prophet elevated the status of women through his treatment of his wives. He taught the AMA that a woman's dignity, her emotions, and her honor are sacred. In a society that once buried daughters alive, the Prophet uplifted women and placed them at the heart of the family and community. To mock a wife by making her feel replaceable or to laugh about marrying someone else is to go against this legacy of honor. Dr. Yasir Qadhi stresses that if a man wants to follow the Sunnah, he should begin not by joking about having more wives, but by embodying the mercy and respect with which the Prophet treated the wives he already had. This prophetic model also reveals a deeper spiritual truth. How we treat our spouses is directly tied to our relationship with Allah. The Prophet FDF said, "The best of you are those who are best to their wives." Notice that he did not say the best of you are those who pray the most or who give the most charity. Though these are also acts of worship, he specifically linked excellence in faith with excellence in spousal treatment. Dr. Yasir Qadhi often reminds us that this hadith destroys the illusion of compartmentalized religiosity. A man cannot claim to be righteous while joking in ways that humiliate his wife. A man cannot claim closeness to Allah while disregarding the pain his words cause at home. True religiosity begins in the household, and the model for it is found in the Prophet of when men reduce the idea of marriage to laughter and jokes about taking another wife, they strip away the honor that the Prophet FDA worked so hard to establish. They forget that marriage is a means of completing half of one's deen, and something so sacred should never be trivialized. Dr. Yasir Qadhi continually reminds his listeners that to follow the Sunnah is not to pick and choose cultural stereotypes, but to live with the same prophetic balance of responsibility, compassion, and respect. To treat one's wife with dignity is to live the Sunnah. To guard her heart from pain is to live the Sunnah. To build a home of tranquility rather than insecurity is to live the Sunnah. And to joke in ways that make her feel replaceable or humiliated is the very opposite of that Sunnah. When men treat the subject of a second wife as a running joke, what they often fail to realize is that their words carry weight not only within their own households, but also across the wider community. Dr. Yasir Qadhi frequently reminds audiences that the tongue is one of the greatest gifts and one of the most dangerous tools that Allah has given us. With it, we can remember Allah and elevate our souls, and with it, we can destroy relationships and break hearts. The Prophet said that a servant may utter a word without thinking about its seriousness, yet it plunges him into the depths of hellfire. This is a profound reminder that even casual humor is not free of accountability. When men consistently joke about marriage in this way, it does more than just hurt their wives. It sends a message to the Ummah that one of Islam's most sacred institutions is something trivial, something laughable, something that can be mocked without consequence. Dr. Yasir Qadhi explains that every word spoken in public, every trend repeated, every joke circulated contributes to the culture of a community. When joking about a second wife becomes normalized, it shapes how young men perceive marriage. Instead of seeing it as a covenant, a mythican GHAL macron letter 1 on 3 anain, they begin to see it as a casual option, a source of banter, or a mark of masculinity. Young women who hear such jokes may grow up feeling devalued, internalizing the idea that their role as wives is unstable, easily replaced, or not taken seriously. Over time, this weakens the very foundation of marriage and society, creating homes built on insecurity rather than trust. Dr. Yasir Qadhi often points out that when the micro units of society, the family, are weakened, the macro structure of the Ummah suffers. What seems like a simple joke then has ripple effects that reach far beyond the living room or the gathering where it was first uttered. There is also the issue of how Islam is perceived by those outside the faith. In an age where Muslims are already under the spotlight, where stereotypes and misconceptions are widespread, careless jokes only add fuel to the fire. Dr. Yasir Qadhi has warned that when Muslims themselves trivialize polygamy in this way, it confirms the negative caricatures that outsiders already hold. That Muslim men are obsessed with multiple wives, that women are not valued, and that marriage in Islam is about desire rather than responsibility. Instead of presenting Islam as a faith that upholds dignity, balance, and justice, these jokes reinforce harmful images that damage dawah efforts and the credibility of the community. Every Muslim must ask, am I adding to the dignity of Islam with my words, or am I diminishing it? Beyond external perceptions, there is also the question of spiritual accountability. When a man makes such jokes repeatedly, he is slowly conditioning his own heart to think lightly of sacred matters. The scholars explain that sins of the tongue, especially when repeated, harden the heart and erode one's sense of awe before Allah's commands. Dr. Yasir Qadhi often stresses that Iman is not lost overnight. It is chipped away gradually, through heedlessness, through mockery, through treating serious matters lightly. To joke about a second wife again and again is to allow one's heart to become desensitized to the gravity of injustice, to the pain of others, and to the responsibility of marriage. A man who laughs about it today may tomorrow take a reckless step into it without any preparation, harming multiple people in the process. The Quran commands believers to speak words that are upright. O you who have believed, fear Allah and speak words of appropriate justice. He will then amend for you your deeds and forgive you your sins. 33:70-71. This verse shows the link between speech and deeds, between the tongue and the heart. Speaking upright words leads to upright actions, while careless words lead to careless actions. When men fill their gatherings with talk of the second wives as though it were a game, they should not be surprised when the culture that emerges is one of broken promises, unstable families, and women who feel disrespected. Dr. Yasir Qadhi makes it clear, words are not cheap, they shape realities. There is also a profound hypocrisy in focusing on jokes about second wives when many men have not yet fulfilled the responsibilities of the first. Dr. Yasir Qadhi highlights this double standard often. How can a man laugh about taking another wife when his current wife is struggling emotionally, financially, or spiritually because of his neglect? How can a man joke about justice between two households when he cannot even uphold justice in one? Such behavior is not only immature but also unjust, and it demonstrates a failure to grasp the very essence of qawama, of being a protector and maintainer. Leadership in Islam is not about flexing authority. It is about service, responsibility, and accountability before Allah. To turn this into a joke is to cheapen what Allah has elevated. At the community level, these jokes also create division between men and women. They foster resentment, insecurity, and suspicion. Wives begin to feel that their husbands are not taking them seriously, while husbands excuse their behavior as harmless fun. This dynamic erodes trust, and without trust, marriage cannot thrive. Dr. Yasir Qadhi reminds us that SHAY letter C, a macron n's greatest joy is to cause division between husband and wife. The prophet letter FD said that SHOY letter 1 places his throne on water and sends his troops. And the one who causes the most damage is the one who creates discord between spouses. If jokes about a second wife are repeatedly sowing seeds of distrust, then they are serving SHRY letter Y named agenda, not the sana of the prophet letter FDF. Defe. What men need to understand, as Dr. Yasir says, is that their words are not just fleeting sounds. They are bricks that build or destroy. They can either elevate the dignity of marriage and inspire the next generation to treat it with seriousness, or they can contribute to a culture of mockery that weakens both families and faith. The Ummah today is in need of men who embody taqwa in their homes, who understand that being a husband is not a platform for jokes, but a field of worship where every word spoken can either be a form of dhikr or a form of diyul. The question every man must ask himself is not whether his friends laugh at his jokes, but whether Allah will be pleased with his words when he stands before him on the day of judgment.